I thought I was guarding the gates of heaven, but I was actually just locking the door and throwing away the key. My name is Elias. I am 34 years old, and until 12 days ago, I was the priest at a small, strict Orthodox parish in the foothills of Denver. I spent my youth studying the fathers of the church, learning the ancient songs, and making sure every candle was straight and every person in the pews followed the rules. I believed that if the worship wasn't perfect, it wasn't for God. But on March 22nd, 2026, I died on an operating table for 11 minutes, and I learned that I was a wolf, wearing a silk robe. If your leader does any of the four things I am about to tell you, run. Do not look back, because you are being led toward a wall, not toward the light. My wife Elena is a nurse. She has a heart as soft as fresh bread. For the 6 years I led my parish, she would often whisper to me at night, "Elias, that young man with the torn clothes who came in today, why did you ask him to leave?" I would tell her that the sanctuary is a place of beauty and order. I told her that people need to respect the house of God by looking their best. Looking their best. I thought I was protecting the holiness of the space. I was really just protecting my own pride. I didn't want messy people ruining the image of my perfect church. We turned away the addicts, the ones who didn't speak our language well, and the ones who didn't fit the mold. I was the first type of false pastor, the gatekeeper. I treated the church like a private club instead of a hospital. Everything changed on that Sunday in March. I was driving home after a long service during Lent. Suddenly, it felt like a thick nail was being driven into my chest. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt like they were filled with wet sand. A blood clot had moved to my lungs. My car veered off the road and hit a concrete pillar at 60 miles per hour. When the paramedics arrived, my heart had already stopped. I didn't see a tunnel. I didn't see my dead relatives. I woke up standing in a place that felt like a cold, empty basement that went on forever. The ground was like frozen mud. There was no sun, just a gray fog that hung in the air like smoke. I saw people walking in circles, their faces as blank as unwritten paper. They weren't screaming, they were just hollow. The loneliness there was heavy as a lead blanket. I realized then that I wasn't in the paradise I had spent my life talking about. I screamed out, "Lord, I did everything right. I kept the fasts. I said the prayers." The silence in that gray place was heavy. It wasn't a peaceful silence, like the one I tried to create in my parish before the liturgy began. It was a silence that felt like it was eating me alive. Every tick of a clock I could no longer hear, every breath I no longer took, seemed to echo in the emptiness. I looked down at my hands. They were pale and translucent, like mist. I realized I was stripped of everything. My black cassock, my silver cross, my leather shoes. I was just a soul, shivering in the mud of a world that felt like it had been forgotten by light. I kept shouting, my voice thin and desperate. I talked about my theological degrees. I talked about the money I had raised for the new iconostasis. I talked about how I had spent hours making sure the incense was the most expensive kind, imported from a monastery overseas. I thought these things were my shield. I thought they were my currency. But the gray world didn't care about my resume. The people wandering around me didn't look up. One woman passed close to me. She was wearing the remains of a beautiful dress, but it was shredded and caked in the same gray mud. She was clutching a stack of papers to her chest. Contracts, deeds, titles. She kept whispering, "I earned this. This is mine. I worked for this." She was so focused on her papers that she didn't see the light when it started to leak through the fog. It began as a small spark, no bigger than a grain of sand, but it was so bright it made the gray fog look like dirty coal. As it grew, the mud beneath my feet began to vibrate. It wasn't a scary shaking like the car crash that had ended my life. It was a rhythm, like a heart beating deep inside the earth. The spark expanded until it wasn't a point of light anymore, but a person. He didn't walk toward me. The space between us simply vanished. One moment I was alone in the dark, and the next I was standing in the presence of the sun. I couldn't look at his face at first. The sheer weight of his existence made me want to hide. I felt like a bug under a magnifying glass. Every lie I had ever told myself, every time I had looked in the mirror and thought I was a holy man, it all burned away. I saw myself clearly for the first time. I saw a man who loved being called father more than he loved being a child of God. I saw a man who loved the smell of the incense more than he loved the people he was supposed to be praying for. "Elias," he said again. The sound was so beautiful it hurt. It felt like every song ever written was playing at once, but in a way that was perfectly clear. "You are looking at your works. Why are you not looking at me?" I forced my head up. My neck felt like it was made of rusted iron, but I managed to lift my eyes. His eyes weren't just blue or brown, they were the color of deep water and old wood and the sky right before a storm. They were eyes that had seen every tear ever shed. They were eyes that had watched the first star being born and would watch the last one die. And in them I saw a grief that broke me. It wasn't anger. I had spent my whole life preaching about a God who was angry, a God who was looking for a reason to punish people. But this Jesus was devastated. He looked like a father who had watched his children burn down their own house while he stood outside with the key. He reached out a hand. His skin was rough, like someone who had worked with stone and timber all his life. There were scars on his wrists, but they didn't look like old wounds. They looked like windows into a place of pure light. When he touched my arm, the gray basement vanished. We weren't in a church yet. We were standing on a street corner in a city I didn't recognize. It was raining, a cold, biting rain that turned the pavement into a mirror. A young girl, maybe 19, was sitting on a plastic crate. She had a cardboard sign that said she was hungry. People in expensive coats were walking past her, their heads down, their umbrellas tilted so they wouldn't have to see her. Then a man walked by. He was wearing a clerical collar. He was checking his watch. He looked exactly like the kind of priest I had tried to be. Polished, professional, busy. He didn't even slow down. He just moved his bag to the other shoulder so it wouldn't brush against the girl's wet hair. "Look at his heart, Elias," Jesus said. Suddenly I could see inside the man. His heart wasn't an organ of flesh and blood. It was a small, ornate box made of gold and velvet. Inside the box was a mirror. The man wasn't thinking about the girl. He was thinking about the speech he had to give at the charity dinner that night. He was thinking about how good he would look on the local news. He was thinking about the holiness he had built for himself. The girl on the crate didn't exist to him because she didn't fit into his story of a perfect life. "He thinks he is serving me," Jesus whispered, and his voice shook with a sadness that felt like a heavy stone. "But he is only serving the image he sees in the mirror. He uses my name to decorate his own life. He is a shepherd who has forgotten that sheep have faces." The scene shifted. The street corner dissolved, and we were standing inside a massive building that looked more like a stadium than a church. There were thousands of people, and the energy in the room was like an electric storm. A man was on the stage, pacing back and forth. He wasn't wearing robes. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my car. He was shouting into a gold-plated microphone, "You are the head and not the tail," the man screamed. "God wants to move the mountain of your debt today. But you have to show him you're serious. You have to sow the seed of your miracle." I watched as people ran to the front. They weren't walking. They were running as if their lives depended on it. I saw a woman in the third row. Her hands were shaking. I could see into her life too. She was a single mother. She had 3 children and a job that barely paid for her rent. She had $100 in her bank account, money meant for her daughter's medicine. But the man on the stage was looking right at her section. He was promising that if someone gave a sacrificial gift, God would heal their family. She stood up. Tears were streaming down her face. She pulled her debit card out of her purse and walked toward the kiosks at the side of the room. She was glowing with a desperate kind of hope. "Watch," Jesus said. The scene sped up. I saw the woman a week later. Her daughter was still sick. The rent was past due. The miracle hadn't come. She was sitting in her kitchen, the lights turned off because the bill wasn't paid. She was looking at a Bible, but she wasn't reading it. She was looking at it with a face full of confusion and betrayal. She thought God had lied to her. She thought she didn't have enough faith, just like the man on the stage had said. Then I saw the man from the stage. He was at a private airport. He was boarding a jet. He was laughing with his assistants about how the Spirit moved during the service. His heart wasn't a box with a mirror. It was a mouth, a giant, hungry mouth that never stopped chewing. It ate the hopes of the poor. It ate the trust of the broken. It ate everything and turned it into fuel for his own comfort. He sells my mercy, Jesus said, and the air around us grew cold. He takes the bread from the mouths of my little ones and tells them it is an offering to me. I was a man who had no place to lay his head, and he uses my cross to build a throne for himself. He is a merchant of lies. I felt a surge of shame. I hadn't been that man. I hadn't asked for jets or gold microphones, but I had been the priest who didn't slow down for the girl in the rain. I had been the man who cared more about the sacredness of the building than the survival of the people in it. The light changed again, turning a harsh, sickly yellow. We were in a small, cramped room. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and fear. About 50 people were sitting on hard wooden benches. At the front, a man with a face like a hawk was leaning over a pulpit. He wasn't shouting. He was whispering, but the whisper was sharper than a knife. If you doubt the word of this ministry, you are doubting God himself, the man said. His eyes were small and dark. The world is a swamp of sin. Your families are infected. Your friends are agents of the enemy. If they do not submit to the authority of this house, you must cut them off. Do you want to be saved, or do you want to be comfortable? I saw a young man in the audience. He looked like he was about 20. He was crying silently. He had a sister who had left the church a year ago, and the pastor was telling him that if he even spoke to her on the phone, he would be cursed. I could see the boy's heart. It was like a piece of glass that was being shattered by a hammer. Every time the pastor spoke, another crack appeared. He loved his sister, but he was terrified of God. The pastor had convinced him that God was a monster waiting in the dark to strike him down if he showed a single ounce of human kindness to someone unworthy. Jesus reached out and touched the air in front of the boy, as if he wanted to wipe away the tears, but his hand passed through. "This is the jailer," he said, his voice a low rumble of grief. "He builds a prison and calls it a sanctuary. He tells my people that I am a tyrant who hates beauty and joy. He uses my word to break the bonds of family and to chain the soul to his own will. He doesn't want followers, he wants prisoners." The sick yellow light of the jailer's room didn't just fade. It curdled like milk left out in the heat. It twisted and turned until the cramped, dusty space blew wide open into an arena of flashing neon and artificial fog. The air smelled like ozone and expensive cologne. A bass beat pulsed through the floor, so loud it felt like it was trying to rewrite the rhythm of my own soul. At the center of it all, standing on a platform that rose and fell like a living thing, was a man in his late 20s. He had hair that was styled to look messy in a way that clearly took hours to achieve. He wore ripped jeans that probably cost more than a month of my mortgage and sneakers that caught the light with every step he took. This man wasn't shouting or whispering. He was performing. He would close his eyes, tilt his head back, and let a single perfect tear roll down his cheek just as the music reached a crescendo. He would hold his hand out to the crowd, and I watched as hundreds of people mimicked his every move. It was a dance, a choreographed display of emotion that felt as hollow as a drum. "The Spirit is telling me right now," the man said, his voice smooth as silk over the speakers, "that there is someone here who has a secret, someone who is holding back. If you want the breakthrough, you have to let go of the control. You have to give in to the fire." I watched as people began to fall over. I watched as they shook and cried, caught up in the heat of the moment. But when I looked at their hearts, I didn't see the light of God. I saw a frantic, hungry energy. They were like people trying to catch smoke with their bare hands. They were chasing a feeling, a high, a momentary escape from the dullness of their lives. And the man on the stage was the one providing the drug. "Look at his hands, Elias," Jesus said. I looked. The man's hands were glowing, but it wasn't the pure, warm light of the Christ standing beside me. It was a flickering neon glow like a sign in a window. Every time he touched someone, a little bit of their own light was pulled out of them and fed into him. He wasn't giving them the Spirit, he was drinking their devotion. He was an actor who had forgotten where the play ended and his own life began. He lived for the applause, for the way the crowd breathed when he spoke, for the power of being the center of their universe. "This is the actor," Jesus said, and his voice was a heavy weight on my chest. He mimics the movements of my grace to satisfy his own need to be seen. He treats the Holy Spirit like a stage prop. He tells my people that if they don't feel a rush of heat or a surge of emotion, then I am not there. He makes them addicts of the moment, and when the lights go out and the music stops, they are more alone than they were before. He has turned my Father's house into a theater of shadows. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. How many times had I focused on the feeling of a service? How many times had I judged the success of a liturgy by how moved I felt by the choir or the icons? I had been an actor too, in my own way, making sure my voice had just the right tone of ancient authority, making sure my movements were graceful and slow to impress the people in the pews. The arena vanished. The music stopped so suddenly it felt like a physical blow. We were back in Denver, but it was a part of the city I rarely visited. It was an alleyway behind a row of crumbling brick buildings. The air was cold and smelled of garbage and old wood. A man was curled up under a pile of damp blankets next to a rusted dumpster. His name was Matteo. I knew this because I had seen him before. He had come to my church once, 3 years ago, asking for a place to sit and be warm. I had told him he couldn't stay because he was disruptive to the beauty of the sanctuary. I watched the scene play out in front of me like a movie. Matteo was shivering. His breath came in short, jagged gasps. He was clutching a small, dirty cross in his hand, the same cross I had seen him holding the day I turned him away. He was praying. He wasn't using the fancy words I had spent years learning. He was just saying, "Please, please, don't let me be alone. Please, just a little warmth." Then I saw myself walk into the alleyway. This was a memory I had buried deep. I was wearing my fine wool coat, heading to a meeting with the bishop. I saw Matteo reach out a hand. I saw the look of disgust on my own face. I didn't see a brother. I didn't see a person. I saw an obstacle. I saw a problem that the city should have handled. I stepped over his hand, making sure my polished shoes didn't touch his ragged sleeve. "He was my guest," Jesus said. The words were quiet, but they felt like they were tearing through the fabric of my soul. "He came to my house, and you told him there was no room. He came to my servant, and you gave him your back. Every time you turned him away, you were turning me away, Elias. You were so busy decorating the temple that you forgot that the temple is made of living stones." I fell to my knees in the gray mud of that alleyway vision. Lord, I didn't know. I thought I was keeping things holy. "Holiness is not the absence of dirt," Jesus replied. And for the first time, he reached down and pulled me up. His grip was firm, his skin warm and real. Holiness is the presence of love in the middle of the dirt. You wanted a God who lived in a golden box, but I am the God who lives in the alleyways, in the prisons, and in the hearts of the ones the world has thrown away. You were so afraid of being stained by the world that you became useless to it. The alleyway dissolved, and we were standing in a room I knew better than any other. It was my own bedroom. Alina was sleeping, her face pale in the moonlight. I saw myself sitting at the small desk in the corner, surrounded by heavy books. I was writing a sermon. I was searching for the perfect Greek word to describe the nature of grace. I was so focused on the ink and the paper that I didn't hear Alina when she woke up. She had been crying that night. I remembered it now. Her father had just been diagnosed with a terminal illness. She had come to the door of my study, her eyes red, looking for her husband. But I hadn't looked up. I had told her I was doing the Lord's work and that I couldn't be interrupted. I had chosen the study of grace over the practice of it. "Look at her heart, Elias," Jesus whispered. I looked at my wife, the woman who had stood by me when I was a penniless student, the woman who had moved across the country so I could take this parish. Her heart was like a small bird with a broken wing. It was huddling in the dark, cold, and exhausted. She didn't need a sermon on the nature of suffering. She needed a hand to hold. She needed her husband to be a human being, not a priest. "You were a teacher of the law," Jesus said, his voice sounding like a bell tolling in the distance. "But you were a stranger to mercy. You spoke of my love from the pulpit, but you withheld it from the person who shared your bed. You thought that being set apart meant being cold. But my heart is the warmest place in the universe. If you cannot love the one you see every day, how can you claim to love the one you have never seen?" The room began to spin. The walls of my house melted away, replaced by a vast, shimmering field of tall grass. The sky was a deep, impossible blue, and the air smelled like jasmine and rain. This wasn't the gray basement from before. This was a place of peace, but I felt more uncomfortable here than I had in the dark. The beauty of it made my own ugliness feel even heavier. In the middle of the field, there was a table. It was long and simple, made of rough wood. There were people sitting at it, hundreds of them. I saw Mateo there. I saw the girl from the rain. I saw the woman who had given her last $100 to the merchant. They were all glowing with a light that didn't come from the sun. They were laughing, eating, and talking. And at the head of the table, there was an empty chair. "This is the table I prepared," Jesus said. "I invited everyone, the broken, the poor, the confused, the ones who failed, and the ones who were tossed aside. But look who is missing, Elias." I looked around the table. I didn't see a single one of the important people from my parish. I didn't see the wealthy donors who had bought our new bells. I didn't see the men who argued over the church bylaws. I didn't see myself. They were too busy building their own tables, Jesus said. They were so worried about who was allowed to sit down that they forgot to come to the feast. They wanted a table where they could be the hosts, where they could decide the menu and set the rules. But at my table, there is only one host, and the only requirement for entry is a broken heart. I felt a wave of such intense regret that I thought my spirit would shatter. I had spent 6 years as a priest trying to make sure the wrong people didn't get to the table. I had been a bouncer for the kingdom of heaven. I had guarded the bread of life as if it were a limited resource that would run out if too many people took a bite. "I am showing you these things not to crush you," Jesus said, and his eyes burned with a light that was both terrifying and comforting. "I am showing you because your time is not yet finished. You died on that table because your old heart could no longer beat. It was too hard, too cold, too full of yourself. But I am a gardener, Elias. I know how to prune a branch so it can finally grow. I know how to break a heart so it can finally beat." The shimmering field began to fade into a series of fast-moving images. I saw a man in a hospital bed, his face hidden by a mask. I saw a group of people in a dark room whispering about a plan. I saw a woman in a uniform walking down a long white hallway. These weren't memories. They were things happening right now in the world I had left behind. "There are more voices you need to hear," Jesus said. "More lessons you need to learn before you return. You think you know what a church is, you think you know what a pastor is, but you have been looking through a keyhole. I am going to open the door." He took my hand again, and the sensation was jumping into a deep, cold lake. The field vanished, and suddenly we were standing in a modern office building. It was sleek, full of glass and steel. A man was sitting behind a large desk, looking at a screen. He wasn't wearing a collar or a suit. He was wearing a polo shirt with a logo on it. He looked like a CEO. "Look at his heart," Jesus commanded. Inside this man, I saw a complicated machine. It was made of cogs and wheels that never stopped turning. It wasn't pumping blood, it was calculating. He was the head of a massive religious organization. He didn't think about souls. He thought about growth. He thought about branding. He thought about how to market the gospel to a younger demographic. To him, the church was a business and the people were the customers. If a certain group of people didn't bring in enough revenue or engagement, they were ignored. If a message didn't test well with the target audience, it was changed. "This is the manager," Jesus said, his voice full of a quiet, burning anger. "He treats my bride like a corporation. He measures the work of the Spirit with a spreadsheet. He has replaced the cross with a logo. He cares more about the vision of his organization than the salvation of a single person. He is the one who turns my Father's house into a den of thieves, not with coins, but with the souls of men." I watched as the man deleted an email from a struggling pastor asking for help. The manager didn't have time for failure. He only had time for winners. The office of the manager didn't just disappear. It seemed to fold in on itself like a piece of paper being crushed by a giant hand. The glass walls shattered into diamonds of light that fell upward, and for a moment we were suspended in a place that felt like the inside of a cloud. It was white and soft, but there was a hum in the air that made my teeth ache. Jesus was still beside me, his presence a steady heat that kept the cold of the void at bay. He didn't look at the disappearing office. He was looking at me, and I felt as though he were reading the very lines of my soul. You are surprised that a man can turn a house of prayer into a counting house, he said, his voice vibrating through the soles of my feet. But you did the same thing with your silence and your rules. You didn't ask for gold, Elias, but you asked for a different kind of payment. You asked for people to pay with their dignity. You asked them to trade their honesty for a seat in your church. You wanted them to pretend they were whole before they were allowed to ask for healing. Before I could answer, the white cloud turned into a dark, rainy evening. We were standing on a sidewalk in front of my own parish. I recognized the chipped paint on the side door and the way the street lamp flickered every few seconds. A car pulled up, a beat-up sedan that rattled as the engine died. A young man stepped out. His name was Leo. He was 24, and he had just finished a short sentence in a local jail for something stupid he'd done when he was high. I knew him because his mother had been a member of our church for 20 years. She had begged me to talk to him. I watched the memory play out. Leo was standing at the door, his shoulders hunched against the rain. He looked terrified. He had a Bible in his hand, a small one with a plastic cover that they give out in prisons. He knocked. I saw myself open the door. I was wearing my vestments because I was preparing for a midweek service. In the vision, I didn't let him in. I stood in the doorway, blocking the path like a stone wall. I heard my own voice, cold and measured. Leo, I'm glad you're out, but we have families here. We have children. You understand that your presence might make people uncomfortable. Maybe once you've been clean for a year and you've shown some real fruit, we can talk about you joining us for worship. Until then, there's a mission downtown that handles people in your situation. Leo didn't argue. He just looked at the ground. He looked at his wet shoes, then at the Bible in his hand. He turned around and walked back to his car. I watched him throw the Bible into a puddle in the gutter as he pulled away. He was the lost sheep, Jesus said, and the grief in his voice was so sharp it felt like a physical cut on my skin. He was the one I left the 99 to find. I had followed him through the jail cells. I had sat with him on the cold floor of his room when he was shaking from the drugs. I had walked him to your door, Elias. I was standing right behind him when you told him to go away. You thought you were protecting the sheep, but you were actually biting the one who was trying to come home. The scene shifted. The rain didn't stop, but the sidewalk turned into a muddy field in a place far away. I saw a man standing on a pile of rubble, surrounded by people who looked like they had lost everything. He was a preacher, but he wasn't talking about hope. He was talking about enemies. He was pointing toward a nearby village and telling his followers that the people there were the reason for their misery. He was using the name of God to sharpen their anger into a weapon. This is the soldier, Jesus said. He thinks my kingdom is a patch of dirt on a map, so he thinks my glory is found in the defeat of his neighbors. He uses the cross as a banner for his own hate. He tells his people that to love me, they must hate what he hates. But I have no enemies among the broken, only children who have lost their way. He takes the wine of my sacrifice and turns it into the blood of war. I saw the hearts of the people listening to the soldier. They were like torches made of black oil. They were burning, but there was no light in them, only heat and soot. They felt powerful because they had someone to blame. The soldier gave them a target, and they loved him for it, because it was easier to hate a neighbor than to face their own pain. Jesus turned me away from the field. The world is full of these fences, Elias. Men build them out of bricks, out of laws, out of money, and out of pride. They spend all their time deciding who is in and who is out. But look at my hands again. He held them out. The light from the scars was so intense I had to squint. There are no fences here. My arms were stretched wide so that no one could be outside of my reach. When I died, the curtain in the temple was torn in two, not from the bottom up, so that man could reach God, but from the top down, so that God could reach man. You tried to sew that curtain back together. You tried to fix the tear I made with my own body. The space around us began to vibrate again. It felt like we were moving through a tunnel made of liquid light. I saw flashes of other leaders, other pastors who were leading people into the woods. I saw a woman in an expensive office who told people that if they were sick, it was because of hidden sin. I saw the people she spoke to, a man with cancer, a mother with a disabled child, and I saw their hearts withering under the weight of a guilt they didn't deserve. They thought God was punishing them because they weren't holy enough, while the woman in the office grew rich off their desperation. I saw a man who used his position to take advantage of the young and the weak. He used his authority as a shield to hide his own rot. I saw the victims, their spirits like extinguished candles, flickering and smoking in the dark. They had been told that to question the leader was to question God. They were trapped in a cage made of divine right. Every one of these men and women claims to speak for me, Jesus said. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was a roar that felt like it was shaking the foundations of the universe. They use my name to build their own houses. They use my words to justify their own coldness. But I tell you, a day is coming when the houses will fall and the words will be silent. Only love will remain. And you, Elias, you were the worst of them because you knew the stories, you knew the songs, you had the truth in your mouth, but you had a stone in your chest. The liquid light tunnel opened up into a place that looked like a vast, quiet library. But the books weren't on shelves. They were floating in the air, their pages turning as if by an invisible wind. Each book was a life. I saw my own life floating there. I saw the day I was ordained. I saw the pride in my father's eyes. I saw the way I held the chalice, thinking I was so much closer to God than the people standing in line to receive the wine. You were a scholar of shadows, Jesus said. I watched a page of my life turn. It was a Saturday morning. I was in my study preparing a lecture on the nature of the Trinity. A knock came at the door. It was a man from the parish, a janitor named Thomas. He was a simple man who struggled with a stutter. He wanted to ask me a question about a verse he had read in the Psalms. I remembered being annoyed. I had told him that these were deep waters and that he should stick to the basic prayers. I had sent him away so I could get back to my deep study. I saw Thomas's heart. It was like a small flickering lamp. He didn't want a lecture. He wanted to know if God still loved him even though he couldn't speak clearly. He wanted to know if he mattered. My deep study was just a way for me to feel superior. I was using the mysteries of God to make myself feel big and Thomas feel small. You took the bread of life and turned it into a puzzle, Jesus said. You made the simple complicated so that you could be the only one with the answer. You were like a man standing by a well telling the thirsty they couldn't drink until they understood the chemistry of the water. But the water is for drinking, Elias, not for explaining. The library began to burn, not with a fire that destroys, but with a fire that cleanses. The floating books turned into gold, then into light. The knowledge I had been so proud of melted away, leaving only the moments where I had actually shown kindness, and those moments were few and far between. I saw one moment that shone brighter than the rest. It was a Tuesday night, years ago. I had been walking to my car and I saw a stray dog with a broken leg. I had stopped. I hadn't thought about being a priest or being holy. I had just felt a pang of real, honest sorrow. I had picked up the dog, taken it to a vet, and paid for its care. In that one moment, I had been more like the man standing beside me than I had been in 1,000 hours of prayer. That was the only time you weren't acting, Jesus said, and his voice softened just a little. In that moment, you didn't care who saw you. You didn't care if it made you unclean. You just loved something that was hurting. That is the only part of you that is real, Elias. The rest is just wood, hay, and stubble. The fire grew until everything was white. My eyes adjusted and I realized we were standing back in that cold gray basement where I had first woken up. The people were still there, wandering in circles. But now I saw them differently. I didn't see sinners or failures. I saw brothers and sisters who were lost because people like me had closed the doors on them. You are going back, Jesus said. I looked at him, terrified. Back to the pain, back to the crash, back to the work, he replied. But not the work you know. I am giving you a new heart, not just a heart of flesh, but a heart of fire. You will not be a priest of the temple anymore. You will be a priest of the streets. You will be a priest of the broken. You will be a person who doesn't guard the gate, but someone who tears it down. He stepped closer, and I felt his breath on my face. It smelled like the earth after a spring rain. There is a person named Jordan. Their life is ending so that yours can continue. Their heart was full of a love that you never understood. A love that didn't ask for permission. A love that didn't look for a label. That heart will beat in your chest. It will be a heavy burden, Elias. It will make you feel the pain of the world. It will make you cry for people you used to hate, but it will be the first time you are truly alive. I felt a sudden, sharp pressure in the center of my chest. It felt like a hand was reaching inside me, pulling out the cold stone I had carried for 34 years. I gasped, but there was no air to breathe. The gray world began to crack like a mirror. "Wait," I shouted. "How will I know what to do? How will I know what to say?" Jesus smiled. It was a smile that could have started a billion suns. "Don't say anything, just love. Love recklessly, love until it hurts, love until you have nothing left. That is the only sermon the world needs to hear." The pressure in my chest didn't stop. It intensified, turning from a dull ache into a searing heat. It felt like a coal from an altar was being pressed into my ribs. I looked at Jesus, and for a moment his face seemed to flicker. I saw him as a child, then as a man covered in dust, then as a king whose crown was made of thorns that bled light. "You think you have seen the worst, Elias," he said, and the air around us turned into a swirling storm of colors. "But the heart is a deep well, and men have found 1,000 ways to poison the water." We were suddenly standing in a valley. It was beautiful, filled with olive trees and the sound of a distant stream. But as I looked closer, I saw that the trees were being stripped of their fruit. Men in long, white robes were standing on ladders, picking every single olive, even the small, unripe ones. On the ground, families were huddling together, their ribs showing through their skin. They were reaching up, begging for just one piece of fruit. The men on the ladders didn't even look down. One of them spoke, his voice echoing through the valley. "This fruit is for the sacrifice. It is for the glory of the temple. If you were truly holy, God would rain bread from the sky for you. Your hunger is a sign of your rebellion." I saw an old woman collapse. She wasn't asking for a miracle. She was just asking for a crumb. I saw the heart of the man on the ladder. It was a cold, hard stone, polished to a shine. He really believed he was doing God a favor by letting the woman starve. He thought the system of the temple was more important than the life of the person standing right in front of him. "This is the priest of the law," Jesus said. "He loves the ritual more than the people the ritual was made for. He would let the world burn if it meant he could keep his robes clean. He has forgotten that I am the bread of life, and bread is meant to be eaten, not hoarded." The valley vanished, replaced by a dark room lit only by a single flickering candle. A woman was kneeling on the floor, her head bowed. A man was standing over her, his hand resting heavily on her head. He was a spiritual father, someone people came to for guidance. "Your husband leaves you because you do not pray enough," the man said. His voice was soft, almost kind, but it had a hook in it. "If you were a more submissive wife, he would stay. This is your cross to bear. Do not seek help from the world. Stay in the silence. God is testing your endurance." I looked at the woman's heart. It was a dying fire, being smothered by a heavy, wet blanket. She was being abused, and the man she trusted to lead her to God was telling her that her pain was a gift from heaven. He was using faith to keep her in a cage. He liked the power of being the one who decided her fate. He liked being the voice of God in her life because it made him feel like a god himself. "This is the architect of shame," Jesus said, and his eyes flared with a light that made the shadows in the room scream. "He takes the heavy burdens I came to lift and piles them on the backs of the weary. He calls it discipline. He calls it growth. But it is only a way to keep people under his thumb. I came to set the captives free, not to give their captors better excuses." The room dissolved into a field of tall, dry grass. A fire was sweeping through the field, and a crowd of people was running toward a river. But standing at the edge of the water was a man with a sword. He was shouting at the people, telling them they couldn't cross unless they could prove they were pure. "Show me your hands," the man with the sword cried. "If there is any stain of the world on them, the river will boil you alive. Only the perfect can touch this water." The people stopped. Behind the fire was roaring, the heat singeing their clothes. They were trapped between the flames and the man with the sword. Some of them began to try and scrub their hands with dry dirt, making them bleed in a desperate attempt to be clean. Jesus walked toward the man with the sword. He didn't say a word, but as he approached, the sword turned into a piece of dry straw and blew away in the wind. Jesus stepped into the river and reached out his hands to the terrified people. "The water is the gift," Jesus said, his voice cutting through the roar of the fire. "It is the water that makes you clean. You do not get clean to come to the water." I watched as the people plunged into the river. The stains of the fire, the soot, the blood from their hands, it all washed away. They emerged on the other side, laughing and weeping. The man who had held the sword was left standing on the bank, alone and angry, because he couldn't control the river anymore. "You were that man at the river, Elias," Jesus said, turning back to me. "You wanted to be the judge of the water. You wanted to make people earn the mercy that I gave for free. You thought your orthodoxy was a sword to keep the unworthy away. But my orthodoxy is the river itself. It is the love that drowns the fire." The scene changed again. We were in a hospital room. A man was dying. He was alone. No family, no friends. He had lived a hard, selfish life. He had cheated people, lied, and walked away from everyone who loved him. He was terrified. He could feel the darkness closing in. Then a nurse came in. She wasn't a religious person. She didn't have a cross around her neck. She just saw a man who was afraid. She sat down next to him, took his cold, trembling hand, and stayed there. She didn't say anything. She just stayed. I saw the man's heart. In the presence of that simple human kindness, the hard crust of his life began to crack. A tiny, fragile spark of light appeared in the center of his soul. It wasn't a grand conversion. It wasn't a perfect confession. It was just a moment of realizing that he wasn't alone. "She did more for him in 5 minutes than you did for your parish in 6 years, Jesus said. "She gave him the only thing that matters, the presence of love. You gave people lectures on the nature of light, but she was the light. You were so busy being correct that you forgot how to be human." I couldn't even defend myself anymore. Every vision was a nail in the coffin of my pride. I felt like I was being stripped down to nothing. "I am showing you the world as I see it," Jesus said. "I don't see the titles. I don't see the grand buildings. I see the light that passes from one person to another. I see the moments where the wall between heaven and earth becomes thin, and usually those moments happen far away from the pulpits and the golden thrones." He waved his hand, and we were standing in a small kitchen. A group of people were sitting around a table, eating soup and bread. They were a mess: an ex-convict, a woman who struggled with drink, a young man who had been kicked out of his home. They were talking about their struggles, their failures, and their hopes. There was no leader at the table. They were just carrying each other's burdens. "This is my church," Jesus said. "It doesn't have a name. It doesn't have a budget. It doesn't have a brand. It just has my spirit. When 2 or 3 are gathered like this, I am there. Not because they are perfect, but because they are honest. You spent your life trying to build something that looked like a church, but you missed the heartbeat." The kitchen began to fade, and I felt that pull again, the pull toward the world of flesh and bone. The heat in my chest was becoming unbearable. "One last thing, Elias," Jesus said. His face was solemn. "You will be tempted to go back and try to fix the church. You will want to argue with the bishops and the priests who are doing what you used to do. Do not do it. You cannot fix a machine that was built to exclude. Just go and be the door. Be the bread. Be the one who sits in the rain with the lonely. Your life will be your only sermon." I felt a sudden, violent jolt. The gray world, the light, the visions, it all began to blur. I reached out for him, but my hands were becoming solid, heavy, and cold. "I'm afraid," I cried. "You should be," his voice echoed, sounding further and further away. "But remember, my heart is beating in you now. You are never alone." The blur didn't settle into a single image, but into 1,000 at once, like a wall of mirrors reflecting every corner of the earth. Jesus stood in the center of the storm, his feet steady on the shifting light. He looked at me, and I felt the heat of his gaze peeling back the last layers of my old self. I was no longer Father Elias, the respected priest of the foothills. I was just a man, naked in his spirit, shivering in the face of a truth that was too big for my mind to hold. "You think your life was a long road of service," Jesus said, his voice sounding like the hum of a hive and the roar of a furnace. "But look at the footprints you left behind." The mirrors merged into one large, vivid scene. I saw a young man named Silas. He had been my altar server for 3 years. He was quiet, diligent, and he loved the ancient chants. One day he came to me in my office, trembling. He confessed that he was struggling with a darkness he couldn't name, a feeling that he didn't fit into the world of men. I remembered my response. I had handed him a book of canons. I had told him he was under the influence of a spirit of delusion. I told him to fast more, to sleep on the floor, to punish his body until his mind gave in. I watched the vision of Silas leave my office. His heart was like a bird trapped in a box of thorns. Every time he tried to breathe, he was pricked by the words I had given him. I saw him a month later, sitting in his car at a lookout point over Denver. He was crying, holding that book of canons. He threw it out the window and drove away, not just from the church, but from God. He thought that if I was the representative of heaven, then heaven was a place of iron bars and cold stone. "You gave him a stone when he asked for bread," Jesus said. "You were so afraid of his questions that you tried to bury him in answers." He didn't need a rule book, Elias. He needed a brother to sit in the dark with him. You chased him into the wilderness because you didn't want his struggle to mess up the clean lines of your parish. I reached out to the vision, wanting to pull Silas back, but the scene dissolved into a different kind of darkness. This was a warehouse downtown, not far from the shelter where I would eventually go. It was filled with smoke. The air was thick with the smell of burning rubber and old, dry wood. This was the warehouse fire. This was where my new life began. I saw a person with bright, multicolored hair and clothes stained with neon paint. This was Jordan. They were standing near a wall, finishing a mural of a massive golden sun that seemed to be breaking through concrete. The fire had started in the basement, a faulty wire sparking in the trash. It was moving fast. Most of the people in the building, artists, runaways, the forgotten, were already scrambling for the doors. But Jordan didn't run out. They heard a cry from the back of the building. 2 small children, the sons of a woman who was sleeping in one of the side rooms, were trapped behind a fallen beam. I watched Jordan drop their paint cans. I saw their heart. It was unlike any heart I had seen in my visions. It wasn't a box or a mouth or a machine. It was a fountain. It was pouring out light so fast it couldn't even contain it. Jordan didn't stop to ask if the children were pure. They didn't stop to ask if the children's mother had followed the rules. They didn't think about their own safety. They ran into the black smoke. I felt the heat of that fire in the vision. It was a physical pain that seared my spirit. I saw Jordan lift the heavy burning beam. I saw their skin blister and their lungs fill with soot. They pushed the children through a small window into the arms of the people outside. Then the roof collapsed. Jesus stood with me in the ruins of that fire. The smoke didn't touch him, but he looked at the place where Jordan had fallen with a grief that made the stars in his eyes dim. This person never stepped foot in your church, Elias. They didn't know the songs you sang. They didn't know the Greek words for grace, but they lived grace. While you were arguing about the color of the vestments, they were dying for my children. This is the heart that was found worthy to replace yours. I looked at my own chest in the vision. I could see the heart pulsing there, glowing with that same fountain-like light I had seen in Jordan. It was a heavy, thumping rhythm. It felt like it was trying to break out of me to reach the world. You received this life because of their death, Jesus said, not just biologically, but spiritually. You are being kept on this earth to be the hands that Jordan can no longer use. You are going to carry their fountain into the places where the water has dried up. The scene shifted again, moving away from the fire and into a bright, sterile room. It was a laboratory. A man was standing there, surrounded by screens and flashing lights. He was a popular speaker, someone who used science and logic to prove that God only loved certain people. He was explaining how some people were designed to be discarded. "Look at his heart," Jesus commanded. Inside the man was a complex set of scales. They were perfectly balanced, but they were made of ice. He weighed everything. He measured the value of a human soul by their productivity, their health, and their bloodline. He used the name of God to justify his own cruelty, calling it natural law. He was a pastor of the intellect, a man who had replaced the mystery of the Spirit with the cold calculations of his own mind. He is the divider, Jesus whispered. He tells people that my love is a merit system. He makes the healthy feel superior and the broken feel like a mistake. He has turned the garden of my creation into a factory where only the perfect are allowed to exist. He is a shepherd of shadows. The laboratory began to melt. The ice scales shattered. We were standing in a field again, but this time it was a field of thorns. I saw a man dressed in rags trying to walk through the thorns to get to a single small flower in the center. Every step he took, the thorns tore at his skin. Behind him, a group of religious leaders were sitting in comfortable chairs, watching him. They weren't helping him. They were shouting instructions. Lift your feet higher. You're not trying hard enough. If you truly loved the flower, the thorns wouldn't hurt you. Jesus walked into the field. He didn't shout. He didn't sit in a chair. He simply lay down over the thorns, making his body a bridge. He looked at the man in rags and said, "Walk on me." The man stepped onto Jesus' back. He reached the flower and picked it. The moment he touched it, the thorns turned into soft grass. The religious leaders in their chairs looked confused and angry. They complained that the man hadn't earned the flower because he hadn't suffered enough. "This is what I have been doing since the beginning of time," Jesus said, standing up. His back was covered in deep red gashes from the thorns. "I am the bridge. But my leaders have tried to rebuild the thorns. They want people to suffer because it gives them power. They want to be the ones who decide who gets the flower. They have forgotten that I already paid the price for every single one of them." I felt the weight of all those years I had spent telling people to earn God's favor. I had been one of the men in the chairs, shouting instructions at the person in the thorns. I had watched people struggle and told them it was their own fault for not being holy enough. The field of thorns faded into a vision of a modern city at night. I saw the glowing screens of millions of phones. On each screen, there was a different pastor or influencer talking about God. Some were selling books, some were asking for donations, some were arguing with each other about who was the most correct. "Look at the noise, Elias," Jesus said. The sound of all those voices hit me like a physical wave. It was a roar of opinions, a sea of ego. It was a world where everyone wanted to be the voice, but no one wanted to be the ear. I saw the hearts of the people watching the screens. They were tired, they were confused, they were looking for a drink of water, and they were being given a bucket of sand. "They have turned my gospel into a competition," Jesus said. "They measure their worth by the number of people who listen to them, not by the number of people they have served. They have made the word of God a commodity. They are like people trying to sell the air. The air belongs to everyone, Elias. It cannot be bought. It cannot be sold. It can only be breathed." The city lights began to swirl, and I felt the finality of the vision settling in. The gray basement, the field of light, the burning warehouse, they were all merging into a single truth. "You are going back to a world that is louder than ever," Jesus said. His face was inches from mine. "You will be tempted to join the noise. You will be tempted to use your experience to make yourself look important. You will want to be the one who saw Jesus, but you must be the quietest person in the room. You must be the one who doesn't talk about the light, but the one who carries it. You are not going back to lead a church. You are going back to be the church." He touched my chest one last time, right over the heart of Jordan. The heat was so intense I felt like I was being forged in a fire. "Don't look for me in the high places. Don't look for me in the arguments. Look for me in the eyes of the person who has no one else to look at them. That is where I am. That is where you will find your life." The world of light exploded into a million pieces. I felt myself falling, tumbling through the layers of existence, back toward the heavy, painful world of skin and bone. The swirling noise of the city didn't just fade, it turned into a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed me back down into the mud of the gray basement. I felt the transition like a fall from a great height. My spirit felt bruised. I was gasping, though I had no lungs to fill. Jesus was still there, but he was different now. He was taller, brighter, and the sorrow in his eyes had turned into a burning focus. "One last shadow, Elias," he said, "before you go back to the light of the sun." He waved his hand, and a new vision took shape. It was a man sitting in a dark room, illuminated only by a small lamp. He had a massive ledger spread out before him. He was writing in it with a frantic, feverish intensity. I looked over his shoulder. The ledger wasn't filled with numbers or names, it was filled with sins. Every page was a record of the mistakes, the lapses, and the secret shames of the people in his congregation. He spent his nights studying this book, preparing his next sermon, looking for ways to correct his flock. He believed his vigilance was his greatest virtue. He thought he was the moral compass of his community. "Look at his neck," Jesus said. I looked, and I saw that the ledger was attached to a heavy iron chain that was wrapped tightly around the man's throat. Every time he wrote a new sin into the book, the chain grew heavier, pulling his head down toward the table. He was so focused on the dirt under everyone else's fingernails that he didn't realize he was being strangled by his own judgment. He had made himself the accountant of heaven, but heaven doesn't use ledgers. "This is the watcher," Jesus said, and his voice was like a low, rolling thunder. "He thinks his job is to be the prosecutor of his brothers. He believes that by pointing out the darkness in others, he is bringing them to the light. But he is only building a monument to his own self-righteousness. He has forgotten that I didn't come to record sins, but to wash them away. He loves the list more than he loves the person." The room with the ledger dissolved, and suddenly we were standing before a massive wall. It was miles long and hundreds of feet high. It was made of something strange. As I stepped closer, I realized it was built out of Bibles, prayer books, and liturgical scrolls. They were stacked like bricks, glued together with a thick, gray mortar of tradition and law. I saw people on the other side of the wall. They were pounding on the books, their hands bloody and raw. They were crying out, trying to catch a glimpse of the light that was shining from behind the wall. But on top of the wall, there were men in expensive robes. They were holding more books, and every time a gap appeared, they would shove a new volume into the hole, sealing it shut. They were shouting down at the people below, telling them they weren't worthy to see the light until they had memorized every page of the wall. "They have used my own words to build a fortress," Jesus said, and for the first time I saw a tear fall from his eye. It hit the ground and turned into a white flower. "They take the stories of my love and use them as stones to keep people out. They think they are protecting me, as if the creator of the universe needs protection from the ones he died for. They have turned the map into a barrier." Jesus stepped forward and touched the base of the wall. The moment his finger brushed the books, the gray mortar turned to dust. The massive structure didn't just fall. It evaporated. The people on the other side were suddenly standing in the full, glorious light of his presence. They didn't look holy or correct. They looked exhausted, messy, and relieved. They fell into the light as if they were falling into a warm ocean. "The wall was never mine," Jesus said, turning back to me. "It was theirs. They built it because they were afraid that if the light were free, they would no longer be the ones in charge of it. But I am the light that no man can contain." The vision of the wall faded, and I felt a sudden, sharp pull toward the earth. The gray basement, the fields of light, the visions of the false shepherds, they were all being drawn into a single point of light that was glowing in my own chest. "Elias," Jesus said, and his voice was now so close it felt like it was inside my own mind. "You are waking up. The heart I gave you is starting its work. Do not let the world make it hard again. Stay soft. Stay broken. Stay open." I felt a sudden, violent jolt, like being slammed back into a suit of armor that was 3 sizes too small. Everything was cold. Everything was painful. I heard a sound like a distant drum. Thump, thump, thump. It was a heavy, unfamiliar rhythm. It was the heart of Jordan. I opened my eyes to the blinding white of the surgical lights. The air was freezing, and my chest felt like it had been ripped open and stitched back together with wire. I tried to speak, but my throat was blocked by a tube. I saw Dr. Patel standing over me. I saw the relief in her eyes, though she was trying to stay professional. "He's back," someone whispered. I spent the next 12 days in a fog of pain and grace. I told Elena everything. I told her about the merchant, the jailer, and the actor. I told her about the gatekeeper, how I had been the one holding the door shut. She didn't judge me. She just held my hand and cried, her tears falling on the same hands that had turned so many people away. On my last day in the hospital, I learned the truth about Jordan. The transplant coordinator told me about the fire, about the mural of the sun, and about how Jordan had died saving those children. When she told me that Jordan was non-binary, I didn't feel the old priestly urge to judge. I felt a surge of love so intense it made my surgical scars ache. I realized that God had used the very person I would have condemned to save the man I thought was so righteous. I haven't gone back to my parish. I sent my resignation letter 3 days ago. I told the bishop I couldn't be a priest of the temple anymore because I had finally met the high priest, and he doesn't live in our buildings. I've spent my time writing letters, 43 of them so far. To Leo, to Silas, to the woman in the rain. I am asking for forgiveness, not as a leader, but as a man who is blind and now sees. Now, as I sit here on April 3rd, 2026, looking out at the mountains, I can feel Jordan's heart beating inside me. It's a restless heart. It wants to go where the pain is. It wants to be in the soup kitchens and the homeless shelters. It wants to love the people that the world and the church has forgotten. I spent 34 years trying to be a saint, but I'm finally learning how to be a human being. Jesus is not coming back for a church that looks perfect on the outside. He is coming back for a church that loves the way he loved, recklessly, scandalously, without conditions. There is still time to change, but not much. Do not waste it like I almost did.